And I like to grab it. You see what I did there? I'm going to keep this in the film. It's not quite a blooper. I always test. After I make a solder connection, I yank it with my pliers and make sure that the solder connection is strong. Because if it's not, and that connection wasn't, the customer will be back. So I always do it the plier test at the end, just make sure the solder connection is strong. So now I'm going to resolder the connection and see if we can make a stronger bond. Again, I know you can't see my hands in the way, but I'll show you the finished product as soon as I get it soldered on. And this is what we're going for. Once that gets clear, I'm going to freeze frame it here. Now I want you to take a look here at the placement of the wire and what I did exactly. I soldered the part on the right, the solder point on the right. That's soldered to the post. That's actually soldered to the post that's coming through the motherboard from the DC jack. And it's soldered right to the end of that post. Then the wire wraps around, and then the solder point on the left-hand side solders to a point that I filed down on the motherboard. Now this basically creates just a connection from the post to a spot on the motherboard where the post should be connecting to. I hope that makes sense. What I'm doing is creating flexibility in that power jack. So see that center pin? That center pin actually bends all the way around through the motherboard and onto one of the solder points that I created. Now I'm going to take the pliers and just test the strength of the connection again. I'm not going to yank too hard, but reasonably tough just to make sure that it makes a strong connection. And it looks okay, so we're going to leave that soldering the way it is. That's done on the bottom. Now these are a little tricky because that power jack, the tip, which basically that tip turns into a post as it comes out of the back of the power jack. That post connects to 2 points on the motherboard. The point that I just soldered to and another point on the top of the motherboard. So there's two, and this is kind of rare, there's 2 points of contact that this post makes on the motherboard. One on the top and one on the bottom. So bottom we just handled. The top, again, we're going to file a little space on the motherboard where that post should be connecting to. We're going to put a little drop of solder on there once we get that filed down so the solder will stick. And then we're going to repeat the process. We're going to take a piece of wire, run it from the back of the power jack, which is the post, to the top part of the motherboard, to the spot I just filed down. I'm going to freeze frame it again here once this gets in view and show you exactly what I did. Now I want you to take a look at this close-up. This arrow is pointing to the post that's coming out the back of the power jack. That's your positive connector. That's the same thing that's coming out this side of the power jack, which is the tip in the middle of that jack. That tip goes and comes out the back of the jack as a post and attaches to this spot on the motherboard. You'll see the little drop of solder I created right here, which is on the same contact point that would be touching, that post would be touching. Now as you'll see, I'm going to be creating a connection from the post to that solder point I just created using a wire. So I'm basically doing the same purpose, the same function as the original power jack did, except I'm using a wire again, just to give it a little flexibility, but it's touching the motherboard in the same spot that the post would be, except we're using a wire. Hope that makes sense again, like I said, and we'll see how it turns out. Now I'm going to take the file again here, and this time I'm going to scuff up the back post of the power jack, which is the center pin. Comes out the back of the power jack. It now becomes a post that goes into the motherboard. I'm going to attach our wire from this post to that solder point I created, but I need to scuff up and scratch up that post so the solder will stick, and that's what I'm doing with this file here. Just take the toothbrush and brush away any little metal particles. I'm going to take a little bit of solder. I'm going to drop it right on that back post. This could get a little tricky. That's why it's good to have a nice thin tip on the soldering iron. Definitely don't use a soldering gun for this kind of thing. Want something very fine. This is only 15-watt soldering iron. And this is the drop of solder I put on the back post of the power jack. Now we're going to cut a little piece of wire. We're going to attach it to the back post, and we're going to attach it to that solder point. Again, I'm using my little pliers here to strip the wire. Probably better use of wire cutters to do this, but I'm getting pretty good at doing it this way. The only danger of doing it that way for stripping the wires, you could actually cut the actual wire that you're trying to strip, so you don't want to do that. And again, I'm using my technique of just tinning the sides, the edges of these wires. Put a little solder on each point. You don't want to use too long of a wire because remember, you have to stick this back into a confined area that may not have the space to fit a large wire. So that's why I use short wires to do this. Okay, I'm going to use the pliers to hold this in place. I'm going to try to zoom in and give you guys a better view here. Let's take the wire, put it in place. I guess it's not really that good of a view, but you'll see the finished product. And touch the wire to that solder point we created on the back of the post. Make sure that that's pretty solid. Pull it with some pliers there and make sure it's a good strong connection. I'm going to bend it so it fits right, it touches right at the other solder point on the motherboard. Okay, the end was a little too long, so I just cut a little bit off. You don't want too much metal showing on the end of these wires because then it has a chance of short circuiting. And I'm just going to take a little bit of solder. It's tough to get a good view here without my hands in the way. Sorry about that, guys, but I'll show you the finished product and you'll get the idea. And that's all it took. Just a little touch of the soldering iron. Let's pull it and see if it's secure. Right now it's going from the post to that solder point we created. And I think we got a winner. And this is what we accomplished. You will see that the wire we just installed there goes from the back post of the power jack and connects to that point we put right on the motherboard, that other solder point. It's basically acting, the wire is basically acting as the post would be, but again, I used it for flexibility. I love using the wires for flexibility because now the customer can be a little more reckless with the power jack and not worry about the brittle solder points breaking because they're both connected with wires now. You got flex. Just want to test it again with the pliers, make sure it's in there well. And we're good to go. Time to put some stuff away, which I'm going to speed up for you guys real quick here. Then we're going to put the rest of the computer back together. Now I'm going to take the CPU heatsink and CPU fan here. You see that broken metal? That's actually how it was removed from the processor. The processor has some metal on it as well. And we're going to have to get that off and probably put some thermal grease on the processor and make a better connection. See, I'm scraping off the metal that is broken. So a lot of times on laptops, the manufacturer likes to use that thin sheet of aluminum or whatever it is to create a connection. But when it rips apart, the seal between the processor and the heatsink is not that great, so we're going to have to do it the good old-fashioned way with thermal grease. You want to get that processor removed of all the gook on there and make it nice and shiny. And then be careful that there's no residue of the paper. If you're using a paper towel like I am, make sure there's no residue of a paper towel. It might burn up. So once I'm sure I get the residue off, it's a little piece of Scotch-Brite I'm using. Just don't use that. You don't want to push too hard with that. You can on the heatsink, but not on the processor itself. In fact, it's not a real good thing to use, but it might give you a little bit clean surface to work with. This gets to be kind of a pain. It's real gummy. When you get under that sheet of aluminum, there's a gummy residue that you have to get off. So just do the best you can. And then once we get a nice clean spot on the heatsink there, we'll reattach it and put a little drop of thermal grease and we'll be okay. In fact, I'm using a real fine grade sandpaper here. Just getting off that stingy residue, which I will speed up because it might take me a while to do this. It actually took me a lot longer than I expected, so we're going to go to the next step here, and then we'll get that CPU heatsink and fan back on. We're going to test the connections we made using our voltmeter. We're going to set it for continuity, touch it to certain points on the circuit that we just created there, and see if, just make sure that there's no short circuit. I'm just touching a ground point, and then those two wires that we put on the motherboard, they're both on the positive side. They're positive points on the motherboard. So if we touch a ground point to one of those points of that red wire we just installed and you hear a beep when you're testing for continuity, then you know, because it should not be touching any ground points, those wires we installed. There should be no contact with ground points. Just take our paintbrush and clean up as much of the bottom case as you can since you got it open. We're going to take the motherboard now. We're going to place it back into its spot. And we're going to see if it fits. Now that we added those wires might be causing a problem where it won't fit now. So I'm just going to try to size it up and make sure that it fits. And I'm just looking to see if when I put the motherboard back, is it gonna create any short circuit with any of the points of the bottom case? Is our red wire going to be touching any points of that case that we don't want it to touch? Because remember, those wires weren't there before, so it's like an extra protrusion. You want to make sure that it fits okay and there's no connections made that you don't want to be made between the case and the wires that we installed. And I think we're going to be okay. Throw the motherboard in there. Again, if it doesn't sit flush, find out why. And in this case, it's not sitting flush because that wire was under there, which is the speaker wire. Now I'm going to speed up the video here. Again, this computer gets put together the same way it came apart. Use the proper screws and the proper holes there. Get it all back together. Clean it up little bits and pieces where you can. Put the wireless card in there. We're going to put that screen back on. Screw the screen down, and then we're going to feed that wireless antenna through. And put it back in the little slot it goes in. Same thing with the LCD cable. Okay, that's in pretty solid. Attach the wireless antenna. Hard drive goes in there. And I'm going to slow the footage down as I install the heat sink on the CPU. Again, get the stickiness off of that CPU. I'm using Scotch-Brite, but just use it very, very gently if you're using Scotch-Brite. Clean it off with the paintbrush, make sure there's a good connection. I'm going to pull out the thermal grease here. I use Arctic Silver, but it's actually the ceramic version. So it's not quite silver, but the company's Arctic Silver. And I put a little dab on there. I like to take a piece of Scotch tape, put it on my fingers long ways, and use it as a little steamroller to level out all the thermal grease, and it's the way you keep your fingers clean. I just don't trust when I just put a little glob of thermal grease on there, it's going to distribute itself evenly, so I like to distribute it a little bit. And now take your nice new clean heat sink, which we hope is clean enough. Sometimes the best way to get that stickiness off is with your fingers. And that's the best we're going to get. So remember to attach the CPU fan. It's vitally urgent. Your computer will overheat. You don't want to cause damage to that processor. And it's a little hairy in there. That's why it might have been a good idea to do this before we put everything back together. But I think we'll be all right. There it goes. And that slides right in there. The fan does. And the heatsink sits right on top of the processor. Make sure it's all lined up. And then I like to screw these back in a crisscross fashion like you're putting on a tire. Distribute the pressure evenly on the processor. And these plates, this is the last plate I got to put on. This covers the fan and the heatsink. They get dusty. They get dirty. Clean them up since you have them out. Like I said, always try to give your laptop back to the customer in a better condition, in a cleaner condition than when you got it. Cleaner is the key word. I even brush off the bottom of that keyboard. Get it all nice and clean. You don't want little particles and residue flitting around on the motherboard, so... You're going to reattach that cable. Make sure it's in far enough, the way it's supposed to be. Lock it down. Make sure it's all lined up straight. Then mount the keyboard back. Usually snaps in under the plate there and then push down at the top. And I know that this particular keyboard screws in two spots. One right next to the CPU fan and the other one where the wireless card goes. Two little silver screws. Very tricky. You would not think that they hold the keyboard in, but... that's what I learned. Then we're going to mount this plate back on, and then we're almost done. Yes, Best Buy worked on this. You can tell by their lovely purple stickers. Chances are they didn't open it up. Otherwise, they may have charged this customer more than this computer's worth. Sorry, Best Buy, but your prices are real high. Make sure all those screws are tight, but don't over-tighten them. Never over-tighten any of these laptop screws. Just snugly fit them in there, and that should be fine. They usually have some kind of, adhesive or glue on the screw itself. That's what that blue and red color is on those screws. You'll see them are coated in blue and red. It's to kind of lock the screw in. And get all those screws in. I'm unscrewing it now for some reason. I forgot something. What did I forget? I think I just remembered, but